There is a man in Connecticut named John Biggs who worked for 33 years at a manufacturing plant, showed up every day on time, never missed a shift unless his kids were sick. Did everything his union and his employer told him to do, including contributing 6% of every paycheck to a pension fund that promised him $3,200 per month when he retired at age 65, and when that day finally came in 2019, when he walked out of the factory. For the last time, he went home to celebrate with his wife and start the retirement they had planned for decades. He received a letter 3 weeks later informing him that his pension benefit had been cut to $1,008. $100 per month, a reduction of 43%, because the fund was insolvent and had entered a federal rescue program that allowed it to reduce benefits to stay afloat. John did not mismanage the fund. He did not make risky investment decisions. He simply showed up and did his job and trusted the system. But the system failed him in ways that he is only now beginning to understand. And when I tell you what actually happened to the money he and 20,000 other workers contributed over decades, when I show you exactly who profited while his retirement collapsed, you will understand why this is not an isolated tragedy, but a deliberate pattern that has destroyed hundreds of pension funds across America while making Wall Street richer than ever. But before I reveal the mechanism they used and the names of the firms that did this and the specific dollar amounts they extracted, let me tell you about a meeting that took place in 2005 at a pension fund office in California. Because what happened in that conference room has been repeated thousands of times, and it explains everything. The pension fund trustees, good people trying to do right by their members, sat across the table from a team of consultants from a major Wall Street firm. Let's call them what they are. Goldman Sachs and these consultants had flown in with presentations and charts and sophisticated financial models, and they explained that traditional investments in stocks and bonds were no longer sufficient to meet the fund's obligations. That in order to achieve the 7.5% annual returns the actuaries said were necessary to stay solvent, the fund needed to get into alternative investments, into private equity and hedge funds, and real estate partnerships and complex derivative strategies that only the smartest money managers understood. The trustees asked reasonable questions. What are the fees? What are the risks? How liquid are these investments if we need to access the money? And the consultants had answers for everything. The fees were higher than traditional investments, but the returns would more than compensate. The risks were managed through sophisticated hedging, and liquidity was not a concern because pension funds have long time horizons and can ride out short-term volatility. What the consultants did not mention, what they actively concealed through complex fee structures buried into documents that no trustee had time to read fully, was that the firm making the presentation would earn tens of millions of dollars in fees regardless of whether the investments performed well. That the private equity funds they were recommending charged a 2% annual management fee plus 20% of any profits, that these fees came out first before calculating returns, and that the entire structure was designed to transfer wealth from the pension fund to Wall Street even if the investments lost money. And the trustees, who are mostly union representatives and retired workers with no financial training, relied on the consultants because they had to, because the alternative was admitting they did not understand modern finance and risking accusations of negligence if they stuck with simple strategies that seemed outdated. So they voted to allocate 30% of the fund, roughly $2 billion, to alternative investments managed by Wall Street firms, and within 5 years that decision had cost them over $400 million in fees and underperformance. And the fund was in worse shape than when they started. But the consultants and the private equity managers and the hedge fund operators had all gotten very rich collecting their fees every year, regardless of results. Now multiply this story by 10,000 pension funds across America, from teacher retirement systems in Kentucky to municipal employee pensions in Illinois to union plans like the one John Biggs contributed to, and you begin to see the scale of the wealth transfer that has occurred over the past 20 years. Conservatively estimated at over $300 billion in fees paid by pension funds to Wall Street firms for investments that systematically underperformed. Simple index funds that costs almost nothing to manage. $300 billion, and that is just the fee. That does not include the opportunity cost of putting money into a liquid partnerships. That locked it up for 10 years while earning returns below what could have been achieved by simply buying and holding an S&P 500 index fund. And it does not include the catastrophic losses that some funds suffered when private equity firms loaded portfolio companies with debt, extracted fees for themselves, and left the companies to declare bankruptcy while the pension fund lost its entire investment. If you are starting to feel sick, if you are thinking about whether your own retirement might be at risk because you work for a company or a government that has a pension plan, and you are wondering what happened to all that money you and your employer contributed, then stay with me, because what comes next is the part they really do not want you to know: the specific techniques they used that are technically legal but morally indefensible, and the names of the people who got rich while American workers lost their retirements. But first, I need you to understand something fundamental about how this was possible, about why pension fund trustees kept making these terrible decisions even as evidence mounted that they were being robbed. Because the answer reveals a corruption so deep that it calls into question whether our entire financial system can be reformed, or whether it is simply a machine designed to extract wealth from those who produce it and transfer it to those who manipulate it. The consultant model is the key to understanding everything. And this is going to make you angry when you see how simple and how brazen it is. Pension funds are required by law to hire independent consultants to advise them on investment decisions. The theory being that professional experts can help trustees navigate complex financial markets and avoid obvious mistakes. And on the surface, this seems reasonable until you learn that the consultants are paid by the same Wall Street firms whose products they recommend. Not directly, but through referral fees and revenue sharing agreements and other arrangements that create undisclosed conflicts of interest. A consultant might tell a pension fund to invest in a particular private equity fund. And what the trustees do not know is that the private equity firm pays the consulting firm a fee for every dollar of pension money they bring in, or that the consultant's parent company has other business relationships with the private equity firm that would be jeopardized if the consultant recommended against them, or that the individuals making the recommendations expect to get jobs at these Wall Street firms when they leave the consulting business, and therefore have every incentive to maintain good relationships even at the expense of their clients. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented fact from SEC investigations and whistleblower lawsuits and journalists who have spent years uncovering these arrangements. And yet it continues because the legal system moves slowly, and the penalties when firms get caught are typically tiny compared to the profits they made. And most importantly, because the complexity of financial markets makes it almost impossible to prove that a bad investment decision was the result of corruption rather than honest misjudgment. How do you prove that a consultant recommended a hedge fund that charged excessive fees and delivered poor returns because of a conflict of interest rather than because they genuinely believed it was a good investment? You cannot, at least not beyond reasonable doubt, which means the game continues and the wealth transfer accelerates, and workers like John Biggs keep getting letters telling them their pensions have been cut while the people who caused the losses face no consequences. Let me give you a specific example that will make this concrete. And I want you to remember these details because they are not they are the standard operating procedure that has become normalized across the industry. The Kentucky Teachers Retirement System, which manages pensions for over 40,000 current and retired educators, hired a consulting firm in 2008 to help them redesign their investment portfolio in response to losses suffered during the financial crisis. And that consulting firm recommended a dramatic shift toward alternative investments, including a particular hedge fund that charged 2.5% annual fees plus 30% of profits. The hedge fund was run by a former executive from the consulting firm, though this relationship was not disclosed to the pension trustees. And over the next 7 years, the Kentucky fund invested over $600 million in this hedge fund and paid over $120 million in fees, and the total return net of fees was less than 3% annually, far below what they would have earned from a simple bond fund with negligible fees. When journalists later investigated, they found that the consulting firm had received payments from the hedge fund for introducing investors, and that several consultants had subsequently taken jobs at the hedge fund or other firms they had recommended. But by the time this came to light, the damage was done, and the money was gone, and the teachers whose retirements depended on that fund were left with reduced benefits. And here is what should make your blood boil. The people responsible for this debacle faced no criminal charges, no loss of professional licenses, no personal financial consequences whatsoever, because what they did was technically legal under the regulations governing pension fund investments. And while there were some civil lawsuits that resulted in small settlements, the amount recovered was a tiny fraction of what had been lost, and the same consulting firm continues to advise other pension funds, and the same individuals continue to work in the industry because there is no accountability for failure when the victims are diffuse and unorganized and the perpetrators are wealthy and connected. But wait, because it gets worse. And I know you are probably wondering how it could possibly get worse than what I have already described. But the private equity component of this story is even more egregious because it involves not just high fees and poor returns, but actual destruction of the companies that pension funds invested in. Companies that employed American workers and produced real goods and provided real services. Companies that were loaded with debt and stripped of assets and driven into bankruptcy by private equity firms that walked away with hundreds of millions while the pension funds lost everything. Let me tell you about what happened to Toys R Us, because this case has been well documented and it illustrates perfectly how the system works to benefit Wall Street at the expense of everyone else. In 2005, 3 private equity firms, Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust, purchased Toys R Us in a leveraged buyout financed primarily with borrowed money that was immediately placed on the company's balance sheet, meaning that Toys R Us now owed billions of dollars that it had not owed before the acquisition, and this debt had to be serviced through annual interest payments that consumed cash that would otherwise have been used for store improvements or inventory or employee wages. The private equity firms, meanwhile, extracted over $400 million in fees for managing the company. Fees that came directly from operations, and therefore from the value that would eventually determine whether pension funds that had invested in the buyout would make money. And they did this while the company struggled under the debt burden and tried to compete with Amazon and Walmart, without the capital to invest in online infrastructure or store renovations. By 2017, it was clear that Toys R Us could not survive with its existing debt load, and the company declared bankruptcy, wiping out over $2 billion in equity value, much of it from pension funds that had invested in the leveraged buyout. And 33,000 workers lost their jobs with inadequate severance because the bankruptcy estate did not have sufficient funds to provide what they had been promised. And the private equity firms, the ones who loaded the company with debt and extracted all those fees, what happened to them? They made money. Not as much as they had hoped, but they made money. Because they had taken the fees up front, and because some of their investment had been structured as debt rather than equity, which meant they got paid before employees and other creditors, and they walked away to the next deal while the pension funds absorbed the losses in the workers. Scrambled to find new jobs in their 50s and 60s, knowing that the factory or retail jobs they had trained for no longer existed in sufficient numbers to absorb them all. This is how American capitalism works now. Not creating value, but extracting it. Not building companies, but hollowing them out. And pension funds are both the enablers because they provide the capital that finances these schemes, and the victims because they ultimately bear the losses when the schemes fail. If these is making you furious, if you are starting to understand that your retirement is not secure because the money that was supposed to be there has been systematically stolen through mechanisms that are complex enough to confuse most people but simple enough once explained, then subscribe now, because I am about to tell you which pension funds are most at risk and what you can do if you are dependent on one of them for your retirement. And I am going to name specific Wall Street firms and specific individuals who have become billionaires from this game while American workers lost everything. But before I do that, I need to show you one more thing, because the theft is not over, it is ongoing right now, and there are proposals being discussed in Congress that would actually make it worse by reducing the legal protection that pension participants have and making it easier for funds to cut benefits when they become insolvent. The multiemployer pension crisis is the next shoe to drop, and most Americans have never heard of it, even though it threatens the retirement of over 10 million workers in industries like trucking and mining, and retail and hospitality. These are pension plans that cover workers at multiple employers within an industry, and they are structured such that when employers go out of business or withdraw from the plan, the remaining employers have to make up the shortfall. But in industries that have been decimated by globalization and automation, there are not enough remaining employers to cover the obligations, and the plans are running out of money. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which is supposed to insure these pensions, is itself insolvent in its multi-employer program, with liabilities exceeding assets by over $60 billion according to their own financial statements. Which means that when these plans fail, there is no backstop, and workers who contributed faithfully for decades will receive pennies on the dollar or nothing at all. And here is the truly sick part. When Congress finally acted in 2021, and passed the Butch-Lewis Act, which provided some emergency funding to prevent the most critical plans from collapsing immediately, Wall Street firms lobbied successfully to ensure that the rescue funds could be invested in their products, which means that even the taxpayer money being used to prop up failing pensions is being funneled through Wall Street and generating more fees for the same firms that helped cause the crisis in the first place. You cannot make this up. It is so brazen that if it appeared in a movie, you would think it was unrealistic. But this is our actual system. This is how power and money actually operate when accountability has been eliminated and capture is complete. Let me show you what you can do if you are in one of these plans. Because despair is not a strategy, and there are actions you can take, even though none of them are perfect. First, find out the funded status of your pension plan. This information is legally required to be disclosed and should be available through your union or employer or on the Department of Labor website. And if your plan is less than 80% funded or has been receiving special funding relief, you need to assume the benefits will be cut and plan accordingly by maximizing your personal savings and considering whether you can delay retirement or find additional income sources. Second, if you are still working and have any choice about whether to participate in the pension or take a higher salary or contribute to a 401k instead, seriously consider the alternatives because a promise is only as good as the ability to keep it, and many pension funds simply will not be able to keep theirs. Third, organize with other participants because political pressure is the only thing that might force reforms or additional rescue funding. And while the odds are not good, they are better if retirees become vocal and visible and make it politically costly for representatives to ignore the problem. But honestly, and I hate to say this because it sounds defeatist, for many people it is already too late. The money is gone and it is not coming back, and they will have to rebuild their lives with less than they were promised and less than they deserve. And this is one of the great injustices of our time, that people who did everything right are being punished for the failures and the greed of institutions they trusted and could not control. John Biggs, the man I told you about at the beginning, has gone back to work part-time at 71 years old because $1,800 per month is not enough to live on, even though he and his wife downsized and moved to a cheaper state and cut every expense they could. And he's one of millions in similar situations. And the people responsible are buying third homes and private jets and donating money to politicians who protect them from accountability. The scale of this theft is difficult to comprehend because it happened over decades and was disguised as normal financial transactions and investment decisions. But when you add it all up, when you calculate the fees and the underperformance and the bankruptcy losses and the outright fraud, we are talking about trillions of dollars that were supposed to fund retirements, but instead went to Wall Street bonuses and carried interest and management fees, and nobody went to jail and nobody gave the money back, and the system continues to operate exactly as before because the people who benefit from it have the power to prevent any meaningful reform. This is not capitalism. This is not free markets. This is oligarchy hiding behind complexity, and it is destroying the social contract that said if you work hard and play by the rules, you will be able to retire with dignity. Do you still believe that the system is fair, that everyone gets what they deserve, that financial markets efficiently allocate capital to its most productive uses? Or are you starting to see that these are myths we tell ourselves to justify a system that primarily serves to make the richer richer while leaving everyone else fighting for scraps? These questions should haunt every American who has been told that their financial future depends on their own individual choices and discipline. Because while personal responsibility matters, it is meaningless in a system that is rigged from the start, where the consultants are corrupt and the investments are designed to generate fees rather than returns, and the legal protections are so weak that even obvious fraud often goes unpunished. If this has opened your eyes, if you see now that your pension or your parents' pension or your coworkers' pensions are not as safe as you thought, then you need to watch what we reveal next, because pension destruction is just one front in a broader war on retirement security that includes 401k, looting, and social security, insolvency, and Medicare rationing. And understanding the full picture is essential to protecting yourself and the people you care about. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications. Share this with everyone you know who is counting on a pension for retirement, because awareness is the first step toward resistance, and collective action is the only way to force the changes that will not happen voluntarily, because those who profit from the current system will fight viciously to preserve it. The choice is yours. You can continue believing that somehow everything will work out and that the promises will be kept, despite all the evidence to the contrary, or you can face reality and prepare for a future where retirement security is not guaranteed, and where the institutions we trusted have failed us completely. And you can join with others to demand accountability and reform while there is still time to save at least some of what remains.